Hello, I'm Jenny Fern and welcome to my library. I'm a chaotic neutral mechanical engineer who's really into permaculture and wants to talk about books. And today I have a reading vlog. And this is a very long spanning reading vlog. I am reading books that I found in my little free library. I didn't think this would be an incredibly long spanning vlog. But here we are. It is February 2025, and I think I started this in mid-summer 2024. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the journey that we go on. I will see you again at the end of the video in my current state. Hello, I'm starting a reading vlog. We're starting to read books that I got from my little free library. We're gonna see if there's any that I want to keep, any that I like. I read one last night, and it's the shortest one. It's Butterfly and Caterpillar by Barry Watts. What I loved about this book is you may recognize this butterfly as a cabbage white butterfly because most people, if they grow brassicas in their garden, like cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, will get cabbage white butterflies. And in the book that I've been reading, The Garden Jungle by Dave Goulson, he goes through and talks about cabbage white butterflies because they have adapted to the chemical compounds in cabbage and are able to not only use and consume the plant, but they can use the chemical compounds to make themselves less palatable so that they give themselves some resistance, which is just really cool. And I know a ton of people see cabbage white butterflies as pests because the caterpillars, when they're young, eat your cabbage, which is a little annoying when you're trying to eat the cabbage yourself. You get holes in it and you get little worms. If you boil your cabbage, you'll get little, caterpillars inside. This follows the life cycle of a cabbage white butterfly. So we have all of these images of the cabbage white. But you know what I thought was so interesting? These caterpillars don't look like the caterpillars that I see. I see these really pale green, almost exactly match the color of the cabbage or the brassica, like collard green or whatever, that they're eating. And I'm like, what? I've never seen this before. And so it just made me so much more curious about different types of cabbage white butterflies. These, the chrysalis, I see these on my wall and under my eaves from the cabbage white. They're like this kind of pale tan color. I'm just really so curious about the different types of cabbage whites. Loved this. I'm a little conflicted on this front because yes, I would love for the children in my neighborhood to learn about the insects that they could actually see in their garden. But on the other hand, I love insects and I'm kind of into this book. I kind of want to keep it because it's just so cool. Leave in the comments if you think I should give this to a kid in my little free library, if I should keep it for myself. And the next book that I have on my docket is The Two Penny Bar by George Simenon. See, the problem is that this is a big old French kind of thing. It was previously published as The Bar on the Seine, and the author was born in Belgium, so it's just gonna be words that I don't know how to pronounce. I read the first couple pages last night, and then I've been having a lot of problems with anxiety recently, and I've been having a really hard time sleeping. Sometimes with anxiety, I get really stuck in my own thoughts even when I'm trying to read, and that's kind of what happened with this. That is how that's going. Hello. I was on a plane yesterday, and the day before yesterday, we did a single night in Vancouver, British Columbia. Went to a beautiful wedding. Our kitten Al is playing with a jingly ball. I am so sorry if the audio is terrible. I started 2 books that I got from my little free library. The first one that I tried after I finished some of the other books that I'd brought, I finished 2 books and then I also started these 2. One was The 2 Penny Bar, which is like a mystery. It's about a man who is a detective, I think, or a cop. And he has been told... See, this is the bad thing about this book, is I was reading it. It is written in the strangest way, which is kind of interesting, but it has been a very challenging reading experience. I have an example, perhaps. They all owned boats, either motorboats or small dinghies. They were all keen on fishing. They lived here for 24 hours every week, dressed in their sailing gear, wandering around barefoot or in sandals. Some of them affected the rolling gait of old sea dogs. More couples than young people. They displayed the rather deep familiarity of people who have been spending every Sunday together for years. That's how this is written, so it's very like bop, bop, bop. No like longer sentiments about anything. So because it's delivered so sparsely, if anything is missed, it's missed forever. You as a reader have to do so much work to like put the scene together because the author does not put the scene together at all. And then you read a bunch of dialogue and you're just supposed to kind of understand what's happening. It's been one of the strangest reading experiences that I've had. There's like this cop detective. He's gone to the Seine. There's like a wedding. And like somebody has threatened somebody's life or something like that. And then there's also like this guy who's going to be executed like the next day or something that this detective had caught previously. I might DNF this just because it's not a good time. I thought it was going to be very easy to read because it is such a short book. But instead it's like way more confusing because it shouldn't be a short book. It's just written so sparsely. The other book that I started was The Swedish Art of Aging Exuberantly by Margareta Magnusson. I'm about halfway through it. I really don't know how to feel about this. It's not bad. I'm not having a bad time reading it. I'm having a hard time a little bit with what this is. It's supposed to be like lessons of like growing old and like she says aging exuberantly. It's about accepting age and lessons that come with age, I suppose. But a lot of this has just been kind of like a memoir or like reflections of her own life, and like I'm learning about like her family and her kids and her husband and stuff like that. I don't know. She does mention that like her perspective is a Swedish perspective, so it's like straightforward to the point, and that's like how she's gonna say things. She's like a no bullshit kind of person. Currently, I just don't really get the point. I don't know. I have an absolute ton of stuff that I have to do today. So last time I talked about this book, I had read maybe about half of it on a plane. And since then, I finished reading this in a hotel room because I had a really wonderful weekend getaway in a nice hotel. How did I feel about this? It was a great book to read on a plane and then in like the spare moments on a little trip. It was, I mean, it's incredibly short. And a lot of it is just this woman reminiscing about her life. She's, I think, 86 when she writes this, and it's in the midst of the COVID pandemic. She had previously written a book called The Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning that was widely popular. She talks a lot about like not a lot, but she talks several times about Marie Kondo. So she definitely has an angle of like minimalism, minimal living, especially when you're an elderly person, making sure that you get rid of the stuff that you would otherwise just be leaving as a burden for your children, assumedly your children. A lot of what she's talking about, like, is her children and her grandchildren, like her family, reminiscing about being a mother, which I guess is a little bit unrelatable for me, even. Clearly this book is somewhat unrelatable because I'm not an elderly woman. But also I can't really see myself being in her position because I'm not planning on having children. And so much of what she's talking about has to do with like her family growing older and like experiences with her family and like lessons from her kids and stuff like that. There are just general lessons. She is trying to provide lessons through these anecdotes, and some of them I did quite like, but overall not the most impactful book. I do have some quotes that I can share. So she grew up in Sweden, and they were evacuated from like the large city in Sweden to a more remote like country place during World War II because they were getting more and more worried about the city being a target. And so she's talking about how she was having like a really nice time at this farmhouse. She says, "I couldn't know it at the time, but when I think back to it now, it seems unbelievable that the extreme horrors and the simple joys of the world can exist simultaneously." That's basically just life, you know? You're either in a terrible situation or you're just living while terrible things are happening. Oh, I actually loved this little story. She's talking about being with her father. "It didn't take long before seagulls and terns were circling us, and ducks were swimming towards us. It was fun throwing bread to them, trying to aim so that everyone got a piece. When the bag was empty, Daddy would bring it to his mouth, take a giant breath, inflate it, and then quickly pop it. Bang! Away the birds flew, making a terrible racket as their wings flapped. It was Sunday's climax. Afterward, we went home to eat lunch." I know somebody at my workplace who does the same thing, and it is sweet, the little acts of joy that you can bring into your life. I don't know exactly about like scaring all the birds away and stuff, and how that might not be the most joyful thing, but the essence. Overall, this was fine. I don't regret reading it. I might not hang on to it. I'm not really the target for this. I thought I might get something out of it. I guess the main thing that I hadn't really thought of before was the slowness and the pace of life when you're an elderly person. Everything just takes quite a bit more time. There are like a lot more like dire consequences to moving quickly, like having a fall or whatever is life-threatening. And so there's just these really slow actions. And so trying to take some joy in the forced slowness of your life is, I think, maybe the primary thing that I got out of this book. The next book that I have coming up for this reading vlog is I Am Malala, which I did start reading also in the hotel room. And so far, I'm not so sure because it is very much written for, at least in my opinion, it seems like it's very much written for teen girls to read, and I'm not a teen girl. So I might just be reading things at the wrong time. I'm still very interested in reading that. I lost footage when I first started reading this book, and when I basically gave up on reading this book, I don't know what happened, but I deleted some files at some point, or I just can't find them. So I'm gonna do a reenactment today. I was like, I need to finish this vlog because this folder has existed on my laptop with these random clips for like half a year. Then I was like, I really just don't have it in me to pick this book up right now because I'm not in the mood. I'm just not in the mood. So I'm gonna pick up this book that I set aside for my little free library in the last time that we looked at books from my little free library. So I'll put in a clip here. The Winter Vault by Anne Michaels. In 1964, a newly married couple settles into a Nile River houseboat. Avery is one of the engineers responsible for moving the towering figures of Abu Simbel above the rapidly rising waters of the Aswan Dam. At the edge of a world about to be lost forever, Avery and his wife Jean begin to create their own world. But it will not be enough to bind them when tragedy strikes and they go back to separate lives in Toronto. There Jean meets Luke John, a Polish artist whose haunting stories of his shattered childhood in occupied Warsaw draw her further away from Avery. But in time, he will also show her the way back to consolation and forgiveness. I gotta say, they had me in the first half. I'm intrigued by this houseboat life because Toronto, not really excited about that, to be perfectly honest. This one I'm also gonna put as like a maybe. I just posted the video where I go through my little free library for all the other books. I started reading The Winter Vault and I was mostly talking about the characters and also how hard I found it to get into this work. Sorry, my cat is using the litter box. They go so aggro sometimes. I was having a hard time getting into this because the language was so like floaty, and she's talking about a civil engineer and I am a mechanical engineer, and I just thought it was very like, it's just not a good way of like actually explaining engineering work. And let me see if I can find some of the quotes that I'd read in my lost clips. There was this line at the beginning of the book that I just thought was so cringy. And it's Jean talking to Avery and she says, "Calculate me," as like a way of flirting with him, which I thought was heinous. He's like calculating and recalculating and envisioning the forces in the stone, and he's like double checking his work a lot, and like every day he has to like recalculate it because of like the conditions that change. That was like a little confusing to me because I basically was just overthinking it. I was like putting on my little engineering hat and I was like, what? I will say the gardening aspects, so being both an engineer and a gardener, the male main character is an engineer and the female main character is really into plants and gardening. And so I actually related more to the gardening aspect and all of that knowledge because I don't know, it kind of did feel more true to my experience. That was my impression of the beginning of the book. I will let past me catch you up on where I picked it back up. Back to past me. Good morning. Hi, my hair looks insane because I just got up out of bed. I've been reading in bed. Continued to read The Winter Vault by Anne Michaels while I was reading in bed. And I have my fan on in there, so to like kind of block out the noise. My next door neighbors are playing this shitty music so loud. It's like, oh God, what? It's 10 in the morning. They've been playing it forever. I'm just frustrated about that because I wanted to enjoy laying in bed late in the morning and reading my book. So my book. Oh my God, I just hit myself in the eye. So this book is unraveling in a strange way. I'm finding some really beautiful lines. I'm also finding some really interesting things to think about. And I guess also just these like little nuggets of like interesting things to research. It is also kind of falling apart for me because of how the story is being told. So our main characters are Jean and Avery. Jean is a Canadian woman who, I think it's like her hometown. I think Avery is an engineer working on a dam structure, and they're going to be flooding this entire area. And so that's kind of how they meet. She is trying to catalog the plants that will be lost, if I remember this correctly, because it's been a while since I picked picked it up last. And Avery is this civil engineer who, when we first get introduced into the story, he is working on a similar dam in Egypt, where he is going to be flooding where Abu Simbel is. So he's kind of overseeing moving those temples from their original location to where they'll be protected. So all of that is very interesting. Like the idea of being a part of flooding an area that had been inhabited, I think is really, really interesting. I had read previously just like articles or like Wikipedia kind of stuff about Lake Berryessa and the town that was lost under Lake Berryessa. To me, it's just very sad when I think about the impact that I can have on this world. And to me, my garden is so important, and I think about losing that all. I've also been thinking about that with respect to fire because of the fires in Southern California. It is entirely possible that my entire town could be lost to a fire in the future. I've thought about that. If our house were lost, they basically like scrape the whole neighborhood because there's so much contamination, and so you end up with these neighborhoods that there's just bare soil. There's nothing left of what had been there before. And I think about that with my garden, that even if there were plants that were resilient to the fire, all of the soil, every aspect of life would be stripped. So in a similar way with these dam projects, everything that these people work towards in this town and in these communities is lost, except for obviously Abu Simbel, which is so incredibly important to humanity that they've decided to move it. I'm having troubles in the way that dialogue is shown. I can kind of show you there how there's no quotes. It's these little dashes. So I'll be reading something and then they'll have like a dash and it'll be a quote, and then like the whole rest of the paragraph or like several paragraphs will be in like this I voice. And the story is not told in first person. So I'm like, what the is happening? And then I have to go back and see like, oh, okay, we're in, somebody's telling us about something. And that's just been very confusing for me because it's not depicted in a way that's obvious. I don't understand why this was chosen. It does not make sense to my brain. But I would like to share a few lines because I think at the beginning of reading this, I was like, this language is really weird. And I still agree. It takes some getting used to, but I actually do think it's kind of lovely. This book feels very like floaty, very like gauzy and ghost-like. It has this, like it's hovering around real life, but it's not quite grounded. It's kind of how I feel when I'm reading this. But I like this line. Who was the first person to desire certain plants for pleasure, to separate these plants from wilderness, the way prayer separates certain words from the rest of language? And this quote as well. The world, she now understood, was always on the verge of flying apart. The only thing holding matter together was the very fact that it had reached its limits. And then, yeah, there's just some things that are like of interest. Like there is some description of the Kon-Tiki expedition, which I don't really know anything about, but I've vaguely heard of it, but it sounds really, really interesting. There's this description of these wildflowers, I think in Poland. I think during World War II, the Germans decided that they only wanted like German plants. So it says, the only legitimate German garden, he said, was the blood and soil rooted garden I tell you all of this for a reason. During the war, there was a strict landscape rules enforced in all of the occupied territories, especially in Poland. Not only were foreigners to be expelled, including the Poles themselves, but also the soil had to be similarly purified. To this end, a botanical purge was ordered against the tiny forest flower, Impatiens parviflora, and that's where the meaning of the little flower you see hidden somewhere in every one of my paintings. So there's like these little gems of like, wow, that is so interesting. But as an overall story, it does feel very detached. Like, I don't know what we're doing. The characters, I'm really interested in Gene. Avery is weird. I don't quite understand him. It just kind of drops these ideas, and it doesn't really go into them in a super great depth. But I feel like that's actually quite nice to mull over. Hello, good morning. I have been reading The Winter Vault this morning. I think I've finally, now that I'm about halfway through this book, figured out how to read it in a way that will help me take what is beautiful about it but tamp down the like uncomfortableness of the book. Also, sorry if my kettle is too loud. Also, Alice crunching over there. But so one of the issues I'd been having with this book is the language is a little convoluted, and it's very like beautiful, and we're like talking about ideas a lot in a very like floaty and ethereal way. And then the other like major problem I've been having is with the lack of quotations and like not knowing who's talking. I think genuinely it doesn't really matter, and that absorbing the beautiful language, absorbing the ideas, and like letting the ideas form a shape in the mind is like a better way to read this than like trying to understand the plot, you know? So it's taken me this long to realize that, because I didn't know if, you know, learning all of these things about these people and these places was going to be required to understand what was happening in the book. And I really think it's more about being in the moment at the time, hearing people's stories as they tell them. Hi. Anyway, it is a really beautiful, there's so many beautiful ideas, and there's just so many really on each page that it's like impossible to like lock them all away for the future. And I just don't think that this book requires you to try to store the information if it's useful for the text in a future time. I don't think that's what this book is. I haven't really read very much like this before. I'm gonna go get my second cup of coffee, tuck back into bed, have Clover's head on my lap and Pebble at my feet, and I'm feeling very grateful, honestly, for my house, my animals, my husband, my garden, the beautiful place that I live. And I don't know, I'm just feeling like a lot of gratitude this morning. I don't know why, but I'll take it. I think I must have intended to do a check-in about this morning, but I forgot to. The Winter Vault, I was reading this morning. It's now the evening and I'm going to pick it back up. Plot-wise, we have progressed quite a lot. I'm now on page 246. And I remember when I was reading the back of this book, I was a little worried. I was like, okay, cool. We're going to see them on the Nile River in a houseboat, going to go back to separate lives in Toronto. And Jean meets Luke John, a Polish artist whose haunting stories of his shattered childhood in occupied Warsaw draw her further away from Avery. And I'm at that point, and I'm not enjoying it. It's okay, but that's not what I wanted. I knew when I read the back of the book that I wasn't going to enjoy that part, and I don't. Because I think you can tell with my dog earring. My dog earring gets really intense, like about here, and then this here stops completely until just now. And that's like all Luke John. Where the title of this book comes from, I've gotten to that point. It says, "When ground is too frozen for the digging of graves," said Luke John, "the dead wait in these winter vaults. There is always a dignity to these buildings, whether made of brick or stone, with expensive brass fittings, or just a humble wooden shed, because they are built with respect for those who will lie within their walls." And I think this is important, because this is the title of the book, obviously, but it's also like a metaphor for what the book is about, which is Jean has had this great loss, this great sadness and trauma, and she is kind of in a time in her life where she's in the winter vault, waiting to be buried. In a way, I feel like she'll be like reborn, right? But she's in this period of life of deep mourning, and it's like she's a frozen body waiting for the ground to thaw. So I do think it's a great name and a great visual for what this book is. And now I'm gonna keep reading it and hopefully finish it soon. Just right off the bat, I do not feel well today, in case that is showing. I don't know what's going on. The Winter Vault. I finished reading this today. I didn't have very much at all to read today. It was maybe like 10 pages or something. I hate to say it, but when I read the back of this book and I was like, okay, you have me in the first half, but the second I'm not sure I'm interested in that. And it's very much the case the second half. It just became an entirely different story. We're introduced to this character who's this artist, and he has these memories from occupied Warsaw, and he's got a lot of trauma and stuff, and the ending I find so strange, and I don't even know where it goes. Sorry if you can hear my kettle, but I'm about to pour a cup of tea and tuck right into bed. Maybe I should hold off a little bit. I probably should do that. I'm fairly certain that I left off my review of The Winter Vault half done. The Winter Vault was a very unique read for me. There was so much going on, and the writing style was really a new experience. The lack of punctuation for dialogue, like no quotations except occasionally when like there's dialogue in the dialogue, there's quotations. This is very confusing. I had a bit of a hard time with that until I just like accepted that it didn't matter who was saying the dialogue, that what was being said was important, and then I could get through it. I enjoyed the first half after I got sunk into the writing, and then we get to our Luke John part of the story. And I had a bit of a hard time with this because even though Avery and Jean are not living together, even though they're like on a break, I still feel it like in my heart that it is an infidelity. I interpret her actions as destructive to the relationships, to both relationships, and that's not how this is presented. That is not how this is presented at all. But I still, because of how I feel about infidelity, I just don't see it as this like healing message that this book provides. Because of how Luke John is introduced, because of who he is in this story as like this other man, I was like, I don't want to hear about him. I don't want to hear anything about him. I enjoyed exploring Jean's background. I enjoyed exploring Avery's background. And I also feel like there was a huge discrepancy in like, we go through Jean's background, we go through Avery to some extent. Those are like an equal partnership. Then we get to the Luke John half of the book. It's all about him. It's all about him, and then also him and Jean in the moment. And I like couldn't shake the feeling that she's just like out there trying to get some strange dick. Like I just had a hard time with that whole portion, even if the content in his background and some of the concepts were interesting. I just had a hard time. And particularly in the second half, I started noticing this thing that started to really bother me in the writing, and it was just lists. There are these incessant lists. I just opened a random page, and here I see flowers that would have reminded them of Greece, Lithuania, Ukraine, Italy, Sardinia, Malta. It's like, okay, maybe just pick like 2 or 3. Like you don't have to do all of them. And that's what a lot of this writing is. It's probably present in the first half and I just didn't mind it as much. I didn't want this book to go in the direction that I did, but of course I knew that when I read the back of the book. I have very mixed feelings about this because so much of this was super interesting. I'm sure so much of this I will have in my brain for a long time. There were also really cool ideas. There's some artistic stuff in here. I can't find the location where this is mentioned, but basically an idea that you could create maps of like moments or maps of very specific things in a town or in a city. And I really love that idea, especially for like a little zine or something. That would be so beautiful. Like there's a lot of poignant things in this story. I don't want to discredit it in any way for the things that it does really beautifully and uniquely and some of the elements that are really cool about this story. But I think ultimately the last half was just not something that I was interested in reading about. And so it was a little hard to get through. I was invested in the first half. Like that's part of the problem in this is like you get invested in their relationship and them as people. And then in the second half, Avery's gone. He's in school and he's just gone. He's not on the page. And so it's just about Jean and this new guy. So at the beginning, it's about them together. It's almost feels like 2 equal halves, and then he's just not even a part of it. And so it was really weird for a reader to just be like, okay, I guess he's not the point of this story, which obviously he's not, but I'm like, so this is just Jean's story? I thought this was a partnership. Anyway, I feel like I've been broken up with this book. Ultimately, that's how I felt about this. I don't regret reading this. I am happy that I picked this up. And I think I probably would be interested in reading more from Ann Michaels if it does not have this type of plot point. So a recap of the books that I read or tried to read. I do not regret taking this from a child, potentially, if I left it in my little free library, because I really appreciate this book. The Swedish Art of Aging Exuberantly. I completely forgot that this was a part of this reading vlog because I feel like I read this so long ago. This was not world changing, but it was definitely a perspective that I was not super familiar with, having the perspective of a much older woman, a woman near death, talking about what it's like to be elderly. At least like I had been nicely introduced to the concept of reading from somebody who's elderly, because I then read No Time to Spare by Ursula K. Le Guin later in the year, and I was like, oh, this is another perspective from an elderly woman. And I feel like if I hadn't read this book first, I like wouldn't have as much understanding of what it's like to be in that situation, because she talks so much about how like slow you have to be so that you don't injure yourself. Yeah, I am happy that I read this, and I definitely took some things out of it. Then there were 2 books that I DNF'd for this vlog. I think I still will address one of them in the future, but this one, The Two Penny Bar by George Simeon. I had a really, really difficult time with the sparseness of language. I thought this was going to be easy to read because it's so short, but the language is so incredibly sparse and things move very hurriedly without any exploration of what things look like. It was written in a style that did not connect with me at all, and so I just couldn't read it anymore. I am Malala. I got to page 14, not very far at all, and this book really, really reads like it is meant for really young people to be reading. That it makes sense considering the context of what the story is about, or this memoir. But I definitely felt too old to be reading this. My main issue was I just was not in the mood. I was waiting for me to be in the mood to pick this back up again, and it just did not happen. This wasn't meant to be for this vlog, but again, I'm definitely going to keep it on my TBR shelf and keep it in the running for reading. And I don't want to read it far in the future. I like to read it somewhat soon. This was definitely different than the first time I did a reading vlog all about books from my little free library. The first time I read them all in a fairly compact time period because they're just things that showed up in my little free library. It's really being exposed to books that other people have been exposed to. And I think on BookTube, and even if you're not on BookTube, if you're just, getting influenced by social media or by the people who you hang out with, if you're reading books from your bubble, you definitely are only reading certain types of things, even if you read broadly. And that's what these forays into the little free library reading has brought to my attention. That even though I do try to read a breadth of things, there are books that I will never be exposed to, and there are books in my little free library that I wouldn't be exposed to any other way but my little free library. I don't find books that I'm so excited about. I don't find books that I love to pieces, except for this butterfly book, which is an absolute aberration. I encourage you to read outside of your comfort zone, as long as it's not harmful to you. Can be rewarding, and it can also not be rewarding, which can help you understand more about yourself. So if you enjoyed this, please consider sharing it with a friend who you think would also enjoy it. Also, consider liking and subscribing, and I will be back again soon.